Hey, it's Phil here. Today I'm going to be talking about the repository pattern. So, today we're going to talk a bit about what the repository pattern is, why would you want to use it, so describes what the pattern is, and then I'm going to show you a class diagram and a coded example, and then we're going to finish up. So, what is the repository pattern? It's an abstraction, uh, and it's used when implementing domain models, or specifically, it's used to separate the job of persisting an object from the object itself, and from the rest of the application. So, what you can often see is in some applications, whenever you want an object, there's like a bunch of repeated code that goes and gets the object from the database or something like that. And this pattern isolates that concern and puts it into a nice little sandboxed piece, so that you can use it whenever you like, and also so you can swap out the implementation of it later. So it might help with reuse. So why would you want to use this? Well, potentially allows you to reuse your business logic with different persistence. It could help you to keep your models pure, and in the domain-driven design world, that's important because one of their practices is that you maintain some business logic and have it in front of your actual business unit users, and they can see in detail what you're doing with the object, and it doesn't have to have details about how you're storing things. And so keeping it simple for your non-technical users to be able to read the code and understand it is really, really helpful. And keeping your models pure is good for that. It can reduce the likelihood that you pollute your object with those persistence and serialization concerns. Can't completely do that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about the example. So it keeps all of that data access layer code together. I feel like I've repeated myself a bit there, but I think that they're separate things that you get from the pattern, but they're all sort of related. So what are some characteristics of a repository? Well, often it has a load and a store method, where you write the object and then you load it back out again at a different time. Sometimes CRUD, and that's partially an implementation sort of concern that's leaking out of the object, of the repository. Yes, deletions are important, but often you can get away with soft deletes. It's responsible for taking an object in its at rest form, so be it in a table, in a data store, in a file on disk, on a machine somewhere else, on tape, whatever, and turning it into a live object that you then interact with in your application, and then turning it back into an at-rest object, storing it and putting it back to sleep. It's often responsible, now I haven't seen this everywhere, but it's often responsible for maintaining a single live copy of that object. And sometimes we sort of tolerate there being multiple copies, but at the time that you save, well, you detect that there have been multiple copies and disallow one of the saves. Sometimes it will validate system level constraints, and an important one of those is that, well, you would only have one of a particular unique constraint in a DB. So if something has to be unique, and often the identifier that they use for the object is that thing, well, you can't tell just by looking at the object whether it's the unique one. You need to actually try to insert it in, and sometimes there are other sort of services that get employed in models that use repositories that are separate and distinct from repositories themselves. But yeah, this is a kind of service that deals directly with persistence. So some guidance from me, I think that you should avoid leaking implementation details like primary keys from your repositories and into your objects. In some environments, this can be really hard. I also think that, and this is, again, this is an opinion thing. I also think that you should treat whichever business object you have there, you should treat that thing as an entire unit, even if there are multiple records that it's aggregated out of. So you might have a root record, you might have, or root class, and you might have little, like, for example, a collection of other stuff in there, and you want to treat that object and its children as a thing, and persist that entire thing, warts and all, and load that entire thing whenever you load it. And that can be really hard to justify sometimes for performance reasons. But I've also seen not doing that actually make performance worse. Okay, so we're going to go and have a look at a class diagram, and that is right here. And this is really simple. We've just got our application, which is, the thing that's going to use the object. It depends on an interface, and in this case, it's the iModel object repository, which is an abstract name. It's sort of like, insert your name here for the kind of object you're going to load and store. We've got our concrete repository, so this is the implementation that actually deals with the persistence, and then that thing creates the model object, which is what you actually interact with in the application. And notably, it has an identity here. And when I say identity, I'm not necessarily talking about a primary key. And oftentimes this is allocated by the application and is known to be unique at the time that you allocate it. So you'd use a GUID or something like that. The date and time or some other combination of reliably unique criteria. And then, this may have other implementation details like a primary key underneath it, but you don't expose it via the model object. And what that might look like in practice, actually, I think I'll show you the code that I have here. So we've got our data object here. It has some properties and some methods. We've got one here which validates that it's an actually well-formed object. And then we've got this other one here that lets you do something to it. And this, this is just characteristic of what a data object might look like. I think you probably have a more concrete name here, like, this is a duck. And, you interact with it. This might have some more complex details underneath it, like a list of properties or, a list of children or something like that. And here is our interface. Again, really simple. We get something and we get it by the ID, and you'll note that that ID is this one here. Or we save it, and you notice that we're also not specifying the ID there. We're just specifying it here. Okay. And where we use it, we've got this. Here's our main method. We write an object here, which is, we're just going to create a new ID for it, create a repository, which, it could happen later. We create our object, and it's got a state here, we update the state. This is us performing a domain operation on it, and then later we save it, and stuff might go wrong there, but after that the object is at rest. And then later we read the object, and that involves obtaining a repository, and then calling get on the object, and then we can see the details of that object here. Concretely, this particular implementation of this iRepository just goes to a file on disk. So we've got this data object ID.json, and we're going to save it to the same JSON file based on the ID there, or load it from that same file. And I've put in a special feature here which will throw an exception if once it's loaded the file it decides that it's not a well-formed object, so you can't actually load a malformed one if somebody's interfered with it on disk. So that's the code. I also wanted to talk a little bit about some implementation options. I guess before I did that, now one of the things here is that loading and storing this object involves having public ID operations, which we have to, like the JSON serializer will get and set these properties. And I think that that's a prospect that you want to consider carefully, like what it means to be able to load and store this object is that you need to expose some operations that could subvert the invariant. And I think that a lot of domain objects, domain models will deliberately only expose methods. And that means that you somehow have to be able to get that data out and into the repository, and you need to put extra interfaces there. Perhaps you want to put in a special constructor or expose a special factory that is only available to the repositories. But yeah, so this is what I mean by it doesn't entirely mean that you can completely avoid persistence concerns, because you still need to decide how you're going to structure your object, but you can still probably, in most cases, avoid specifics about the particular way that the object's stored. And to sort of illustrate that, I've got this set of examples of how we might store this object. We could store it as a plain, table in a database with a primary key. And in this case, the primary key that we've got there is the GUID that we allocate, which is fine. It's a fine option. It's got the name and the state, and we just store those into rows and columns. But can you see that this is how we've done this as a persistence concern, right? It's not, we're not confined to using this format by anything but the implementation of the repository. Here's another example. We have an ID here, which is, again, the same ID that we used there, the GUID, and then we have a blob, and the blob might contain everything, including the ID there, and then we would just surface the ID so that it's searchable. We might also, if we had a lot of properties, but we only needed to search by some of them, well, we turn those into columns and turn the rest into the JSON blob. If we had quite a big aggregate there, but we only needed to search by the name or the date or something like that, well, those other things in the aggregate don't necessarily have to be other tables. there might be performance reasons or other reasons for convenience that you don't want to have to do all of that extra work. Like loading objects from a data store can be quite inconvenient because of the way that SQL and its responses need to rectangularize the data. And if you're storing stuff in a blob, well, you get an advantage there that you might be able to just do it in one transaction. Obviously, there's a trade-off there that, well, you're not actually verifying that the data is correct, and you can have constraints on these columns to say that they have to be in a particular format, but obviously it's not necessarily the case. In the JSON blob, that has to be taken care of in the application. Okay, here's another option. We might have a primary key that we allocate in the database and that we never surface to the application, but we look it up by this ID field, which is our GUID, and then we store the values for each of those things. We might have one row per value, so here's the field name, here is the value, and this is the time that it changed. And when you're loading an object, you might just find the most recent one of those values. And when you save it, you might actually just save each of the values and the time that it was saved. And that will mean that you'll have some history. Okay, so moving on. Summing up, a repository pattern's an abstraction, and it helps separate the persistence concerns from the business logic, and it might help you with reuse. I'd love to hear what you thought of this. There's my email address, my Twitter, my threads, and my GitHub, or you could like and comment underneath. And that's me for this time. So talk to you next time.